Stand in Florence's Piazza del Duomo today, and you're surrounded by Renaissance grandeur. Brunelleschi's dome rises 114 meters above you, the largest brick dome ever constructed. Giotto's bell tower stands to your right. The baptistry's bronze doors, sculpted by Ghiberti, tell stories in gilded relief. 4 million tourists visit this square every year, but rewind exactly 1,000 years, to the year 1000 AD, and stand in this same spot, and almost nothing you recognize would be there. No cathedral dome that wouldn't be built for another 420 years. No Giotto's campanile. No gilded bronze doors. No marble facades. Instead, you'd see a small church called Santa Reparata, a modest Romanesque structure that would eventually be demolished to build the cathedral that stands today. You'd be in a town of perhaps 5,000 to 8,000 people, a fraction of a percent of modern Florence's 380,000 residents. This was Florence before the Medici, before Dante, before the banking empires and artistic revolution that would make it the cradle of the Renaissance. This is Florence as a forgotten medieval town, struggling between warring powers, 3 centuries away from greatness, political reality. WHO ruled Florence. To understand Florence in 1000 AD, you must first understand that it was not the independent, powerful republic it would become. Florence was a minor town in the Margrave of Tuscany, itself part of the Holy Roman Empire. The Holy Roman Emperor in 1000 AD was Otto III, crowned in 996, ruling until his death in 1002. The empire nominally controlled Italy, but actual power was fragmented. The Margrave of Tuscany, the regional ruler appointed by or allied with the emperor, controlled Florence and the surrounding territory. In 1000 AD, the Margrave was Hugh, who ruled Tuscany from 969 to 1001. The Margrave's authority was military and administrative. He collected taxes, commanded armed forces, administered justice, and maintained fortifications. The Margrave resided primarily in other Tuscan cities and visited Florence periodically to assert authority. Real daily power in Florence belonged to 2 groups: the bishop and local nobles. The Bishop of Florence was a major figure. The church owned extensive lands, collected tithes, and wielded spiritual authority that translated into political influence. The bishop resided in Florence, oversaw religious life, managed church properties, and often mediated disputes. In an era when literacy was rare and concentrated in the clergy, the bishop's administrative capabilities made him indispensable. Local nobles, families who owned land in and around Florence, formed a military aristocracy. These families owed service to the Margrave, but operated with considerable autonomy on their estates. They would become the ancestors of later powerful Florentine families, but in 1000 AD, they had not yet achieved the wealth and sophistication of the Renaissance patriciate. There was no city council, no commune, no republican government. The Florentine Republic, with its complex system of guilds, councils, and elected officials, would not emerge until the late 11th and 12th centuries. In 1000 AD, governance was feudal, hierarchical, and centered on personal loyalty to the Margrave and emperor. The ghost of Rome urban layout. Florence in 1000 AD occupied roughly the same location as modern Florence on the northern bank of the Arno River, in a valley in the Tuscan hills, but the urban geography was dramatically different. The city's boundaries were defined by ancient Roman walls, built when Florence was the Roman colony of Florentia, founded in 59 BC. These walls, constructed in the 1st century AD, enclosed approximately 20 hectares, about 50 acres, in a rectangular grid pattern. By 1000 AD, these walls, nearly 1,000 years old, still stood, though sections had collapsed or been crudely repaired with medieval masonry. The Roman street grid survived in modified form. The Cardo North-South Main Street and Decumanus East-West Main Street remained the primary thoroughfares, but medieval development had made them narrower and more irregular. Buildings encroached on the streets. Alleys branched off in organic, unplanned patterns. The rational geometry of Roman urbanism had been overlaid with centuries of medieval adaptation. The Arno River was both resource and threat. It provided water and served as a transportation route, but it flooded regularly. The low-lying areas near the river were marshy and prone to malaria, especially in summer when mosquitoes bred in stagnant water. Floods could inundate parts of the city, and the river's course was not yet controlled by the embankments that would be built in later centuries. There was a bridge across the Arno, though not the current Ponte Vecchio, which dates to 1345. An earlier bridge existed on or near the same site, a wooden or mixed wood and stone structure on Roman foundations, connecting Florence to the south bank. This bridge was critical infrastructure, linking the city to roads leading south toward Rome. The population of 5,000 to 8,000 people did not fill the space within the Roman walls. Large sections were gardens, orchards, vineyards, or simply empty ground. The city was not densely built. Open spaces existed between clusters of buildings. Agricultural activity occurred within the walls. People grew vegetables, kept chickens and pigs, and maintained small plots. The area outside the walls, the borghi or suburbs, had minimal development. A few buildings existed along the roads leading from the city gates, but most activity was concentrated within the Roman wall circuit. Architecture: stone, wood, and salvaged. The architecture of Florence in 1000 AD was simple, utilitarian, and built largely from salvaged Roman materials. Most residential buildings were 2 or 3 stories tall, constructed with stone foundations and lower walls, with upper floors often built in timber and wattle and daub. Wattle and daub woven wooden lattices filled with clay, mud, straw, and animal dung, then plastered, was the standard wall construction for upper floors and less wealthy buildings. Roofs were covered with terracotta tiles, a continuation of Roman building traditions. The tiles were made from local clay, fired in kilns, and laid overlapping to shed rain. Buildings had small windows. Glass was expensive and rare, so windows were often covered with wooden shutters, oiled cloth, or thin sheets of horn that admitted some light. The urban landscape was dominated by scavenging. Almost all construction used spolium materials salvaged from Roman buildings. Columns from abandoned Roman structures were incorporated into medieval churches. Marble was reused or burned in lime kilns to produce mortar. Bronze fittings were melted down. The Roman past was not preserved but recycled. The most important building in Florence in 1000 AD was the Cathedral of Santa Reparata. This church, which would eventually be demolished in the 14th century to build the current Florence Cathedral, was a modest Romanesque structure. It was built on the site of earlier churches, possibly dating back to the 4th or 5th century, but the building standing in 1000 AD was likely a Carolingian or early medieval reconstruction. Santa Reparata was stone-built, with thick walls, rounded arches, and a wooden roof. The interior was dark, lit by small windows and candles. Decoration was minimal compared to later Gothic or Renaissance standards. Some wall paintings, carved stone capitals, simple altars. This was the spiritual center of Florence, where the bishop presided and where the population gathered for major religious ceremonies. The baptistry of San Giovanni, the octagonal building that still stands today, existed by 1000 AD, though its exact construction date is debated by historians. It was built on the site of an earlier structure, possibly a Roman temple or an early Christian baptistry from the 4th–5th centuries. The building standing in 1000 AD was likely an early medieval structure that would be extensively remodeled and decorated in the 11th and 12th centuries. It served as the city's baptistry, where all Florentine Christians received the sacrament of baptism. Other churches existed but were small, simple Romanesque structures serving local parishes. Examples would include early versions of churches like San Lorenzo, founded in the 4th century, but rebuilt multiple times, and other parish churches that would be demolished or rebuilt in later centuries. There was no grand civic palace, no Palazzo Vecchio built 1299 to 1314. Administrative buildings were simple structures, likely near the cathedral or bishop's residence. Stone for new construction came from local quarries in the Tuscan hills. The Pietra Serena, the gray sandstone characteristic of Florentine architecture, was already being quarried and used. Though on a much smaller scale than in later centuries, Population and social hierarchy. The population of Florence in 1000 AD, estimated at 5,000–8,000 people, was tiny compared to the city's Renaissance peak of over 100,000 in the 14th century. This small population was rigidly stratified by birth, occupation, and legal status. At the top stood the local nobility families who owned land in the countryside surrounding Florence and maintained residences in the city. These nobles were military men, obligated to provide armed service to the Margrave. They owned horses, weapons, and armor, marking their status as warriors. They lived in the best stone houses, ate the best food, and monopolized what little political power existed at the local level. The clergy formed a parallel elite. The Bishop of Florence headed the local church hierarchy. Below him were canon senior priests attached to the cathedral, parish priests, monks, and lower clergy. The clergy were the educated class. They could read and write Latin, maintained records, copied manuscripts, and provided the administrative skills that secular society lacked. Below the nobility and clergy was a small emerging merchant and artisan class. This was not yet the powerful merchant patriciate that would dominate Florence in the 13th–15th centuries. In 1000 AD, merchants were modest figures trading in local goods: grain, wine, olive oil, wool, leather. Artisans included blacksmiths, carpenters, stonemasons, bakers, and other craftsmen serving local needs. These people were legally free, could own property, and had some standing in society, but they had no political power. The majority of the population consisted of agricultural workers, laborers, servants, and the poor. Many people living within the city walls were involved in agriculture, tending fields and vineyards just outside the walls, keeping animals, growing vegetables. The distinction between urban and rural life was blurred. Florence was more an agricultural settlement with urban characteristics than a true city. Slavery had largely disappeared in Tuscany by 1000 AD, replaced by serfdom and other forms of unfree labor. Serfs were bound to the land they worked, owing labor and produce to landowners. While Florence itself had fewer serfs than the countryside, the social structure was still based on legal hierarchies of freedom and obligation. Women's status was determined by their family's position. Noble women managed large households and could sometimes influence family decisions through male relatives, but they had no formal legal or political power. Women from merchant and artisan families worked in family businesses, managed households, and engaged in textile production. Peasant women performed agricultural labor alongside men. Across all classes, women's primary roles were household management, childbearing, and supporting male economic activities, daily life work, food, and survival. Daily life in Florence in 1000 AD was shaped by agricultural rhythms, limited technology, and the constant struggle for subsistence. Most people woke at dawn, as artificial light was expensive. Candles made from tallow or beeswax and oil lamps burning olive oil provided light after dark, but these were used sparingly. Work and activity followed daylight hours. Breakfast, if eaten at all, was bread and perhaps some cheese or watered wine. The main meal came at midday and consisted of bread, pottage, a thick soup or porridge made from grains and vegetables, beans, onions, cabbage, turnips, and occasionally cheese or preserved meat. Bread was made from barley or rye for common people. Wheat bread was for the wealthy. Meat was rare for most, perhaps salted pork or fish on feast days. The Arno provided some fish, and game could be hunted in the surrounding hills, but protein was limited. Wine was the standard beverage. Water from wells and the Arno was often contaminated, making wine safer to drink. Even children drank watered wine. The Tuscan countryside produced wine and olive oil, the foundations of the local diet and economy. Work occupied most of the day. Farmers worked fields outside the walls, growing wheat, barley, vegetables, grapes, and olives. The Tuscan landscape was less cultivated than it would become. Much land was still forest, scrub, or uncultivated hillside. Agricultural techniques were primitive by modern standards: wooden plows, hand tools, draft animals, low crop yields. Craftsmen worked in small workshops. Blacksmiths forged tools, horseshoes, and weapons. Carpenters built and repaired structures. Stonemasons quarried and shaped stone. Leatherworkers made shoes, belts, and harnesses. Weavers produced wool cloth, though Florence's famous textile industry was still in its infancy in 1000 AD. Most craft production served local needs rather than export markets. Women managed households, which was labor-intensive. They spun wool, wove cloth, preserved food, brewed ale though wine was more common in Tuscany, baked bread, and cared for children. Childbirth was dangerous, and infant mortality was extremely high. Perhaps 30 to 50% of children died before age 5. Life expectancy at birth was around 30 to 35 years, though those who survived childhood might live to 50 or 60. Sanitation was primitive. Human and animal waste was dumped into pits, thrown into the street, or disposed of in the Arno. There was no organized waste removal or sewage system. Disease was rampant: dysentery, typhoid, malaria from the river marshes, and periodic epidemics. Medical knowledge was limited to folk remedies, herbal treatments, and prayer. Serious illness usually meant death. Hygiene was minimal. Public bathhouses in the Roman tradition had largely disappeared. Most people washed hands and faces in basins, but rarely bathed fully. Parasites, lice, fleas, intestinal worms were universal. The smell of medieval Florence would have been overwhelming by modern standards: human waste, animal dung, rotting organic matter, smoke from cooking fires, tanning operations, and unwashed bodies. Economy local and limited. The economy of Florence in 1000 AD was primarily agricultural and local. This was not the banking and textile powerhouse it would become. Agriculture dominated. The countryside surrounding Florence, the Tuscan hills and valleys, produced grain, wine, olive oil, vegetables, and livestock. Most of this production fed the local population. Surpluses were minimal. There was no significant export economy. The wool industry that would later make Florence wealthy was in its earliest stages. Sheep were raised in the Tuscan countryside, producing wool that was spun and woven locally. But in 1000 AD, this was small-scale production for local use, not the sophisticated, large-scale textile manufacturing that would emerge in the 12th and 13th centuries. Markets operated in designated areas, probably near the cathedral or along main streets. Farmers from the countryside brought produce to sell. Craftsmen displayed their wares. Merchants traded basic goods: salt, iron, wine, oil. These markets were local affairs, serving the immediate region. Long-distance trade was minimal. Florence in 1000 AD was not on major trade routes. The city's later commercial dominance would come from banking and textile exports, neither of which existed yet. Some goods moved along the roads connecting Florence to other Tuscan towns and to Rome, but the volume was small. Coinage was in limited circulation. The Holy Roman Empire minted silver deniers and pfennigs. Some Italian cities had local mints, but most economic transactions among common people involved barter, trading goods and services directly rather than using money. Only larger transactions or dealings with distant merchants required coins. The church was a major economic actor. The Bishop of Florence and local monasteries owned extensive lands, fields, vineyards, forests. They collected tithes, 10% of agricultural production from the faithful, and rents from tenants. Monasteries operated as economic centers, farming their lands, producing wine and oil, and maintaining some craft production. Taxation supported the Margrave's administration and military forces. Taxes were collected in kind: grain, livestock, wine, or in labor obligations. The tax burden was heavy and resented, but it sustained the feudal power structure. Religion: the church's dominance. The Catholic Church was the most powerful institution in Florence in 1000 AD, dominating spiritual life, education, culture, and holding significant economic and political power. The Bishop of Florence was the city's most important figure after the Margrave, and often more influential in daily affairs. The bishop oversaw religious life, managed church properties, administered justice in religious matters, and provided social services. The Cathedral of Santa Reparata was his seat. Religious observance structured daily life. Church bells rang throughout the day, calling the faithful to prayer and marking time. The canonical hours matins, lauds, prime, terce, sext, none, vespers, compline organized the day for clergy and regulated the rhythm of work and rest for the population. Mass was celebrated in Latin, which the common people did not understand. Liturgy was ritualistic and participatory only for the clergy. Lay people attended and observed, but did not actively participate in the service as modern Catholics might. Preaching was less emphasized than ritual performance of the sacraments. The church calendar structured the year. Easter, Christmas, Pentecost, and numerous saints' feast days were celebrated with special services, processions, and communal gatherings. These festivals provided the main breaks from labor and were central to social cohesion. Monasticism was important. Benedictine houses, following the rule of Saint Benedict emphasizing prayer, work, and study, operated in and around Florence. Monasteries preserved literacy and learning. Monks copied manuscripts, maintaining libraries that contained religious texts, some classical works, and administrative records. In an era when secular education had virtually disappeared, monasteries were the only institutions preserving written culture. Relics, bones, or belongings of saints were venerated. Churches housed relics believed to perform miracles, protect communities, and provide intercession with God. Pilgrims visited Florence to venerate these relics, bringing some revenue to the city. The church also provided charity, the only organized social welfare. Monasteries and churches distributed alms to the poor, provided basic medical care in hospices, and offered hospitality to travelers and pilgrims. However, the church was also deeply intertwined with secular power. Bishops and abbots were often appointed based on family connections and political loyalty rather than spiritual merit. Church offices could be bought simony. Clergy sometimes lived worldly lives, far from monastic or clerical ideals. The gap between the church's spiritual teachings and its actual practice was significant. Defense and insecurity. Florence in 1000 AD was vulnerable, defended primarily by ancient walls and the limited military forces of the Margrave and local nobles. The Roman walls, nearly a millennium old, still provided the primary defense. These stone walls enclosed the city, with gates controlling access. The walls were roughly 4 to 6 meters high in most sections, though parts had collapsed or been repaired with medieval masonry of inferior quality. Defensive towers punctuated the walls at intervals, providing observation points and defensive positions. The gates at the main entry points from the roads leading to the city were fortified with wooden doors that could be closed and barred. Guards manned the gates, controlling who entered and exited, collecting tolls on goods passing through. Military forces were limited and feudal in organization. The Margrave could call upon his retainers, mounted warriors, knights, who owed military service in exchange for land grants. These numbered perhaps a few dozen for Florence specifically, though the Margrave could summon larger forces from across Tuscany. Local nobles maintained small armed retinues, a few mounted warriors and armed servants. These forces protected their estates and could be mobilized for city defense in emergencies. A militia of townsmen could be assembled when needed. Free male inhabitants were expected to serve in defense of the city, bringing whatever weapons they possessed: spears, bows, axes, knives. This force was untrained and poorly equipped, but could man the walls or provide numbers in a crisis. Warfare in this period was small-scale and often consisted of raids, sieges of fortified positions, and battles between small armies. Combat involved cavalry armed with lances and swords, infantry with spears and shields, and archers. Armor was limited leather or padded cloth for most fighters, with chainmail reserved for wealthy warriors. Florence itself was not a major military target in 1000 AD. It was a minor town in a contested region, not rich enough or strategically vital enough to attract major assaults. The real threats came from feuds between local nobles, banditry on the roads, and occasional conflicts between the Margrave and rival powers. The city's greatest vulnerability was not military but environmental. Floods from the Arno, Fires, timber buildings were highly flammable, disease epidemics, and crop failures posed more immediate dangers than enemy armies. What Florence was not. It is crucial to understand what Florence was not in 1000 AD. It was not a cultural or intellectual center. There was no university. The University of Florence would not be founded until the 14th century. There were no public debates, no libraries accessible to lay people, no philosophical schools. Literacy was confined to clergy and a tiny elite. The brilliant intellectual ferment of the Renaissance was 6 to 7 centuries in the future. It was not a center of artistic production. The paintings, sculptures, and architectural masterpieces that define Florence today did not exist. Art was limited to religious frescoes in churches, carved stone capitals, simple wooden crucifixes. The names we associate with Florentine art, Masaccio, Donatello, Brunelleschi, Michelangelo, Leonardo, were centuries away from being born. It was not politically powerful or independent. Florence was a subject town, ruled by external powers. The proud, independent Florentine Republic that would dominate Tuscany and challenge popes and emperors had not yet emerged. It was not wealthy. The banking families, the Medici, Strozzi, Pazzi, did not exist. The textile industry was primitive. International trade was minimal. Florence in 1000 AD was economically insignificant. It was not populous. With perhaps 5,000 to 8,000 people, it was smaller than many contemporary cities. Constantinople had 300,000 to 400,000 people. Rhoda in Islamic Spain had perhaps 100,000. Even Rome, though much reduced from its ancient glory, had 30,000 to 35,000. Florence was a minor town. The transformation from the Florence of 1000 AD to the Florence of the Renaissance took centuries of commercial development, political evolution, artistic innovation, and demographic growth, none of which was inevitable or predictable in 1000 AD. From forgotten town to Renaissance jewel, Florence in 1000 AD was unremarkable, a small medieval town with an ancient Roman wall, governed by distant powers, its economy based on local agriculture, its architecture simple stone and timber, its population struggling with disease, hunger, and insecurity. Standing in the Piazza del Duomo today, surrounded by Renaissance magnificence and crowds of tourists, it is nearly impossible to imagine this place as it was a millennium ago. No Brunelleschi's dome soaring overhead, no marble facades, no artistic treasures, no wealthy merchant princes, just Santa Reparata, a modest church in a modest town, serving a modest population trying to survive in the wreckage of the Roman world and the uncertainties of the medieval one. The transformation would come, but slowly. The rise of the wool trade in the 12th and 13th centuries brought wealth. Banking families accumulated fortunes. Republican government emerged, giving power to merchant guilds. Population grew, reaching 100,000 by the early 14th century. Artistic patronage flourished. The cathedral was rebuilt on a grand scale. The Renaissance dawned. But in 1000 AD, none of that was visible. Florence was simply another Tuscan town, distinguished mainly by its Roman walls and its position on the Arno, awaiting historical developments that would transform it into one of the most important cities in human history. The Florence we know, the city of the Medici, of Dante and Michelangelo, of Renaissance art and architecture, was built on the foundations of this forgotten medieval town. Understanding that modest beginning makes the later achievements even more remarkable. The cradle of the Renaissance was once just a small town of a few thousand people, living among Roman ruins, ruled by distant lords, with no hint of the glory that lay centuries ahead.